I am Gautam Kumra, Chairman of McKinsey Asia, and you're listening to the Future of Asia podcast series. The Asian century has begun. The region is now the world's largest economy. As Asia's economies evolve further, the region has the potential to fuel and shape the next normal. In each episode, we are going to feature conversations with leaders from across the region to discuss what Asia's rise means for businesses across the globe. Join us.
Hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of the McKinsey Future of Asia podcast. I'm Debbi, and I will be your host for today. I'm delighted to welcome two very special guests with me, Jacob and Seckin, who will be talking about the future of work in Australia, and in particular the impact of generative AI on workforce and productivity. I'm very happy to have the both of you join us today. Before we start proper, would you both like to introduce yourselves to our audience?
Thanks, Debbi. Hi, everyone. I'm Seckin Ungur. I'm a partner in McKinsey's Sydney office. I lead our education and skills practice in Australia, and I've done a lot of research on the impact of automation on the future of work, and most recently co-authored our report on generative AI and the future of work in Australia.
Hi, everybody. Jacob Johnson, Associate Partner in the lovely bush capital of Canberra, Australia. I lead much of our work in the public sector, and I'm excited to give a bit of a practitioner's view in terms of helping different clients adopt different types of generative AI, and along with that, different types of analytics and digital products over the course of the last few years.
To start off, let's go big picture. Seckin, what do you think the impact of generative AI will be on productivity?
I think the potential is huge. That what we know from our report is that even with the technology that's available to us today, 62% of tasks could potentially be automated right now. And by 2030, that could rise to anywhere between 78 and 98%. And that offers massive potential for productivity improvements, anywhere in the order of between 0.2 to 4.1% per year, with Gen AI contributing roughly sort of a quarter to half of that. But it all depends on how bold we are in adoption. We've modelled a couple of different scenarios in our report, and in the midpoint scenario, we assume that about 27% of tasks would be automated by 2030, so a bit short of the 62% potential. But if we were able to even achieve sort of half of the potential, we get Australia back to sort of the productivity growth of 2% per annum, which is actually in line with our heyday post the 1990s. So massive potential, but it all depends on our ability to adopt the technology and adopt it in a way that actually drives productivity improvements.
The huge difference is going to be in adoption here. And looking at productivity growth in Australia over the past 20 years, most of it has been a mining productivity boom. And so I think that if we think about this type of productivity gain, it's quite different. And it gives huge potential for broad-reaching consequences across all different types of skill types and job types across the economy, not concentrated in one place. But I think the challenge here is the ranges that we're giving are huge. And if I look at some of the practitioner examples, we've got cases where people are using free text analysis to get survey insights, and we're taking analysis times from 3 months to 3 minutes. And so you're seeing just the drastic reduction in specific tasks. And the exciting part about this is you're seeing improvements in not just the quantity of tasks, but the quality. So if I think about this example I just shared, there are teams of people who used to spend time trying to synthesize results. Now, with the help of a tool, they can have the prevalence and magnitude of different insights and spend their time thinking about what they should actually do to change the course curriculum of these trainings that have the surveys. But I think, again, the big difference here is this isn't going to be a story of everyone improving or becoming more productive at the same rate. This is going to become a highly divergent story of some early adopters driving radical change in automating these tasks, and others who lag behind are going to not reap these benefits as quickly.
So Jacob, Seckin, I know that both of you talked about how productivity is impacted across different skill types and job types. So following on that point, then can you explain to the audience how the different sectors of the Australian economy is being impacted by generative AI? What skill shifts do you see are emerging?
If we just take three very different sectors in the Australian economy, for example, retail, trade, financial services, insurance, and public sector, what we see is that there's massive potential in all of these sectors, but in different ways. So, for example, in retail trade, Gen AI has the ability to introduce much greater personalization in customer service. It can improve inventory and supply chain management and augment functions like customer service and marketing. Whereas if you look at financial services and insurance, the types of things that Gen AI can help improve are risk assessment, fraud detection, software development, and also customer service. And roughly a third of those task hours could potentially be automated by 2030 in that sector. In public sector, Gen AI has the potential to enhance education delivery and improve outcomes, improve interactions with citizens, for example, by augmenting customer call center operations, improving processing times for welfare, for tax. It can help with financial analysis and R&D. And this can lead to significant productivity gains, but also improvement in accuracy of services and improve the speed of service delivery for citizens as well. If we think about the skill shifts that this leads to, there's going to be an increasing demand for skills that really combine technological proficiency with social and emotional competencies. So, for example, healthcare workers will need to develop digital skills alongside their traditional medical expertise. We also know the demand for basic cognitive skills is decreasing, while roles that require complex problem solving, critical thinking, and importantly, interpersonal skills are on the rise. Educational requirements are also shifting. We've got a growing need for higher education and specialised training, in particular in STEM, healthcare, and professional services, which are industries and occupations where we expect to see significant growth going forward.
So if we think about some of these things where there's excitement, what we could call resilient and growing things, and as Seckin mentioned in science and technology, healthcare, and not meant to be self-serving here, potentially professional services. So we're looking at net demand increases by 2030 of up to 1.5 million additional jobs. Again, I think here the nature of the work, though, will be quite different, as Seckin mentioned. So if we take professional services and we take ourselves as an example, we have used generative AI to change the way we start working with our clients. Our whole knowledge management system is available through an internal generative AI system. We are thinking about how we can actually really get leverage for each individual analyst starting so that they're not just a person doing something, but they have the whole nature of the knowledge of the organization behind them. When we think about these jobs and we think about the sectors, and even though they're growing, the type of work that individuals in these jobs will do is quite different. Of course, there's the stalled but rising category that comes after that. And these are things where we'll see things continue, but maybe not rise as quickly because they are needed and won't necessarily be automated by Gen AI. And this is mechanical installation, repair, rebounding as infrastructure grows. I think it's helpful to take a step back and think about the fact that we're talking about generative AI, but let's not forget about traditional AI and combined with exciting things like robotics. And so right now we're focusing specifically on what generative AI will do to different types of jobs, but these types of infrastructure and construction jobs may change radically due to innovations in artificial intelligence combining that with robotics. I think the last category that we see is this disrupted and declining, where we could really see jobs continue to shrink in sectors where they're already declining. And this is across things that you would expect in different support roles, customer-facing roles, and shifting to e-commerce.
So what insights have you in particular gained from working with organizations to scale and create value through generative AI?
I think that there are some things that are surprising to me and different than assumptions I had a couple of years ago. And then there are some things that have really reaffirmed how I think about digital and analytics changing the way that we work. Maybe the one that's a little bit different, and that is I've seen certain use cases of generative AI inside organizations have rapid increases in adoption that I haven't seen of other products. And these are things that all of us could use in many of our day-to-day lives, which are things like concision and content generation and being able to take large amounts of information and simplify them to be able to share them with our boss or different committees. And the reason I've seen these rising quickly in some pockets of organization is because the value tends to accrete to the individual. And so I see people who support senior executives who are able to get a higher quantity of their work done much faster in synthesizing things and getting them up to their bosses that they couldn't do 6 months or certainly a year or two ago. And I think that's a big difference from how we've seen technology adoption in organizations historically, where we're trying to do large scale digital transformations and change. And it's hard to get individuals to change their behavior for something that might benefit the whole organization. And I'd say there's another category of things that have reaffirmed certain things that are hard fought lessons of driving organizational change. And that's that change management still matters. And the things that matter around being able to role model change, being able to help people understand the change that needs to happen, being able to train them in new ways of working, and being able to set up incentives that change behavior. One example of the way that an organization can rewire behavior and actually step up the ladder to adoption of different types of generative AI is in helping people understand incrementally how it can make their lives better and improve the performance of an organization. So if you take a customer facing organization, you can use generative AI to understand historical interactions between customers and then give feedback to customer service representatives on how they behaved in the past. After that, step 2 is you can actually give them a sense of what customers they might interact with and what are the interactions and things that they could change about their behavior or things that they could do with those customers and give it to them beforehand. Step 3 might be that you do that in real time and you provide feedback for an individual of how they can change their interaction with a customer. And step 4 might be you actually let those interactions go directly to the customer. But I think there's not a foregone conclusion that we need to take all the steps, but what is the right thing for the organization to do for how they want to leverage this technology to improve their interactions with customers in this instance and the way that employees work.
The thing that strikes me is the number of organizations who are very passionately rolling out use cases and proof of concepts and pilots, but not really thinking strategically about the value that this can add to the organization. How is my organization and my industry being disrupted or has the potential to be disrupted by Gen AI, and how do I really get some value out of that? I'd love it if more organizations were thinking about that sort of top-down strategy behind what they want to get out of Gen AI, because if in the absence of that, productivity will come, but you almost sort of leave it up to chance what happens, how that productivity is actually deployed. And the default could be that it sort of gets absorbed into employee experience. Employees save time on the tasks that they would otherwise have been doing manually, and that time can get reinvested into doing more of what they were doing or doing it better and providing a better customer experience. Or it can not lead to actually any more or better, but just lead to a better employee experience. And that may well be a legitimate choice, but my push to organizations would be, let it be a choice. Be deliberate about whether you want that time saved through the productivity that Gen AI or other automation technology can offer. Whether you choose whether you want that to go into employee experience or whether you actually expect there to be more output or better output or less people doing those tasks as a result of implementing this technology. In the absence of doing that top-down strategic thinking, then the potential for the technology to actually deliver value for the organization and for the customer is limited. And often it doesn't scale because we've got a bunch of pilots and use cases that the sort of tech side of the organization is really excited about. But if it hasn't been done in collaboration with the business, with the intent of driving business value, it's difficult to make the business case to then invest in scaling that technology and really having it drive broader productivity and value for the organization and ultimately for our economy.
For me, Seckin, you really hit the nail on the head here, that the incremental productivity shifts for individuals and pilots and use cases will not necessarily lead to business model transformation. And I think as I've seen different clients wrestle with this, that's not an excuse to not get started, because I think even though the technology side of the house can get quite excited about tech for tech's sake, it is pretty important for the organization to figure out how they're going to deal with certain concerns that people have about this technology, certain limitations of the technology, and work through that with certain use cases. So I have certain clients who are using all on-premise generative AI solutions So bringing on large language models into their own environments, disconnecting them from the internet so that they can partition data and information and not share it out again. And so that's been something that will be important for them to do, whether it's a small thing or a big thing, and they need to work through that. And it builds a certain level of trust from the organization. They can maintain certain levels of integrity, certain levels of safeguards that need to be put in place. I think that we'd be silly to think that those things will take care of themselves as well. Seckin, to your point you made on the business model transformation, I think this will vary widely by industry. And again, we're focused on generative AI, which is largely in knowledge work, can be quite powerful in making things more concise and generating content. But if you're talking about productivity and physical things like mining operations, traditional AI, robotics are going to play much more of a role than generative AI. So I think organizations and leaders need to kind of stare into, as Seckin said, where is the value going to lie? And what role is generative AI going to play in that versus other new and innovative technologies?
And also, what other elements of my operating model do I need to change in order to reap the value from Gen AI, right? So in order to scale some of these use cases, organizations need to think very differently about how they store and organize and use data. The sort of traditional concept of data lakes that a data analytics team pulls for you in order to develop a new product, that may work for a one-off use case, but if you want actually the technology to be easily accessible and used and new innovations to be driven across different parts of the business, then, perhaps you need to start thinking about what are those, commonly used data products that I need to make easily accessible on a self-serve basis to my whole organization? And how do I ensure that they have the right tech skill and ability, at least to be able to understand what they could do with that data? Because if that is a skill that we know going forward is going to be an absolute must. This, basic digital literacy is no longer a nice to have. It's going to be a requirement of almost every job going forward.
You were implying some limitations here, Seckin, of what this technology can do and what it can't do. And I've seen clients come and ask me for generative AI to do things that it should not. And I don't mean ethically. I mean, it's just not the right tool. And so one example was clients came to me and said, there are lots of different parts of the government and this organization that are telling me what to do. I have tasks that are all over the place. How do I prioritize these tasks? Can I just ask a large language model to tell me what tasks are important? And my answer is no, that's not the right tool for this. It could give you a synthesis of the different types of tasks you're being asked. It could tell you about historically what types of tasks. It cannot prioritize for you and tell you these are the most important things that you should be focused on. At the end of the day, this technology is just predicting the next token, the next syllable that will come after that. It's not thinking through and telling me how to run my organization, how to tell me what's the most important thing, or even telling me the exact number. So I think we just need to be careful as we're leveraging these technologies for all the power that they have, as Seckin said, to help educate people in terms of what they're actually doing so that we don't trust them to do things that they're not really fit for purpose.
Seckin, any other maybe shifts you're seeing or any potential oversights that could perhaps impact generative AI's role?
Let me give you an example of something that happened recently. We were using generative AI to come up with some futuristic images for some client work that we were doing. The client noticed that all of the images were of a thin young woman who was dressed in a particular way. And they weren't comfortable with that because it didn't actually represent the diversity of the population. And we tried playing with the Gen AI tool to generate more diverse images, and it wasn't very good at doing that. And I think that's just sort of showcased one of the limitations of this new technology because it is new and it's relying on data that it's been trained on. And if that data isn't representative, if it's got bias within the data, then the results will also have bias. And so it really just highlighted for us the sort of limitations that we need to be aware of and how to address it proactively, because otherwise we do get ourselves into these situations where, to Jacob's point before, perhaps may not be the right tool at this point in time for what we were trying to do.
So thank you both for such an interesting discussion. But I think before we close it off, I know we've been talking a lot about current obstacles and challenges and also current opportunities, but I did want to ask you a question on the future. So while you can never be too sure about anything, what do you think the evolution of generative AI will look like over the next decade or so?
It's the $1,000,000 question. What we do know is that the pace of change is very rapid. When we did this automation research back in 2019, we projected out again to 2030. Back then, we estimated that roughly 40% of tasks would be automated by 2030. And now that figure is 62%. And some of those specific capabilities, like creativity, which one would think would be a uniquely human attribute, we estimated in 2019 that wouldn't be automated for another 20, 30 years. And yet today we know that capability can be automated. And in a couple of years, it'll be automated to the sort of top quartile of human performance. So the scale of change is just so rapid that where this could go in 10 years, who knows? But we know that it will be very different to what we're experiencing today. If we get to that point where 80 to 98% of tasks are able to be automated, then it's going to require us to think very differently about what is the role for humans in the future of work. How do we integrate with technology to be able to create better outcomes for citizens by leveraging those aspects of humanity that truly are unique? And to me, that does come down to, as we were discussing before in terms of the skill shifts, those socio-emotional skills, the ability to use our ethics and judgment to point the technology in the right direction and ensure that it's being used for good instead of for potentially destructive tasks. I think that's sort of the future that we need to stare into is what is, the technology will continue to evolve and it'll get better, it'll get more accurate. There'll be more and more that'll be able to be automated. We need to come to terms with, what's the human role in that? How do we continue to skill and upskill in order to keep up with it and to be able to point it in the right direction? We also need to think about what happens in a world where actually we've sort of reached generalized artificial intelligence and the machine is able to run AI on itself and do everything that a human would do. What does the future of work look like in that environment for humans?
I think there's kind of two ways to look at this. One is trying to look at how the technology is changing and how far it will get us. And I think as we've talked about, generative AI has limitations because of what it's doing. The technology innovation that will have to take us to artificial general intelligence will be different. But as we've proven with our difference in reports from 2019 to 2024, the only thing that's certain is we'll get it wrong. We can make our predictions and we can say what we think might happen, but potentially what else is certain is that the world that my kids will be in as working in as adults will be quite different than the one that I'm in right now. And I think what we should try to encourage our children to do is dream about what the future really could look like and not be bound to a linear path of thinking about where it's come from and what it might be in the future. And I think that's such a great thing about the next generation is they're not constrained by certain ways of thinking that we've been brought into. And maybe I'll just leave us with one last example, looking back well over 100 years about an innovation that changed things differently than people initially thought. And that was when electric motors came in and started to take over for steam engines. And the first people who started to implement these electric motors replaced these large steam engines in factories with big electric motors because they knew that they would be cheaper and faster, cleaner and safer. And that was the initial thought of how electric motors would transform business and manufacturing in particular. Well, it took folks, entrepreneurs like Henry Ford and Ford Motor Company, a number of years to figure out that it was actually the size and scale of electric motors being much simpler and smaller that you could have them run at different speeds and build a production line that completely revolutionized the way we thought about manufacturing for well over 100 years now. And I think that's kind of the question I would leave us with is we all know what the technology can do, and we know we're replacing certain ways that we do things today. But how is this going to change the fundamental way we think about how our society lives and operates and works?
Thank you, Seckin and Jacob, for this really insightful discussion. To all of our listeners at home or on the road, wherever you are, thank you for joining the McKinsey Future of Asia podcast today.
You have been listening to the Future of Asia podcast by McKinsey & Company. To learn more about McKinsey, our people, our latest thinking, Visit us at mckinsey.com/Future of Asia or find us on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook.